I believe that emotional intelligence can change the world. Consider for a moment some of the most formative experiences of your life. Often these are quite painful, such as your parents' divorce, an impact of an addiction, abuse, mistreatment, or trauma. Now consider this. Who is the key player in that formative experience? And answer this. How high was this particular person's emotional intelligence, the ability to perceive and understand and manage their emotions, and judiciously and empathetically be in relationship? Now, I will guess that the answer is no, not high. And oh, how different things would have been if so. That father who never knew how to father because he never had it modeled for him. That insensitive colleague, the manager that's so toxic, and that abusive ex. Truly, hurt people hurt other people. Now, raise of hands, how many of you grew up in homes where emotions were valued and validated, where you really felt emotionally comforted as needed? If you look around the room, I would say from my vantage point, majority did not. So like many of you, I actually grew up in a home where emotions were definitely not validated or valued. And so I remember in the emotional tumult of my parents' divorce that I was hurting inside just like everybody else. But get this, we never talked about it. And so I, at the earliest of ages, became a researcher and a student observing these unhealthy dynamics, these dysfunctional patterns. And I asked myself this, what constitutes a emotionally mature versus immature person? And what drives this very hurtful, painful behavior? And how does this cycle of hurt people hurting other people stop? And so I like to say that I believe in emotional intelligence so much that I became a psychologist because I actually started my career in technology as a product manager. And there it was again. I saw patterns of emotional intelligence, low emotional intelligence in the workplace, whether it was individuals who didn't know how to deal with their emotions under pressure, or avoiding conflict, not giving or receiving feedback, as well as lots of unhealthy dynamics in teams where there was mistrust and siloed work, as well as managers that didn't listen. And now I actually see many, many studies that show that emotional intelligence is actually more important in some cases than IQ. And now I delight in bringing a very unique blend of human behavior expertise as well as real world experience as a woman in technology. I'm a psychologist, an exec coach, as well as a consultant, having consulted almost the last 2 decades in the technology space. As much as we believe that our personal problems and issues and past stay at home, they largely do not because we're contextual and holistic beings. And so I will coach many people who have very low self-esteem or self-perception because it's totally marred from past trauma. I also coach many people with very high IQ and business intelligence, yet they have a lack of attunement to people, very careless in their actions, and that totally hampers their effectiveness as a leader. And we talk about diversity and inclusion, we talk about growth mindset. These are all emotional intelligence issues because our work is only as good as our work with people. We cannot move from inspiration to action without the emotional intelligence muscle to break all the psychological barriers within ourselves and in our relationships that may hold us back. So today I am inviting you to an intimate conversation with yourself. Together, we're going to actually go through 3 main arenas of emotional intelligence that I really believe are at the root of what a lot of the behavior is. First, the power of thoughts. Second, the power of feelings. And thirdly, validation. My intention today is really to open up self-awareness and revelation where needed, and to really whet your appetite for more. So I love this analogy of an iceberg, where when we think about behavior, I will read lots of things about emotional intelligence, and sometimes they'll just say, you just need to be more civil. You just need to be kind. Great, got it. But you know what? There's something deeper underneath that needs to be addressed for every one of us. And so I remember actually coaching somebody recently who is a new manager trying to get over his fear of giving feedback. And I told him, I looked at him in the eye and I said, I can give you tips and tricks and frameworks, but you will not do it. If we don't address the root, nothing will change. So I am going to start this time with what's called a centering exercise. We're going to take a minute to really reflect on what is that for you? What holds you back? And I want to encourage you, there's going to be times, like any good counseling or coaching, there might be some discomfort. And I just want to encourage you to actually listen to that discomfort, to lean into that discomfort instead of shirking back from it. At the same time, I know that in a room this size, we have different experiences in life, and there might be a few things that come up and bubble up that's very triggering. And I want you to know that I really prioritize your emotional safety. So that means that if you need to take a breather, if you need to even leave the room, I will not be offended because I really respect that you know what you can and cannot do today, right? So let's take a look at our worksheet. You have a worksheet on your table and a pen. Grab one. It's going to be an individual exercise. Don't feel bad if you can't answer it in the 1 minute that we have, but it's just going to start to get the juices flowing. So let's think about this. Number 1, what behavior or habit do you engage in that holds you back, right? It could be everything from an addiction to a bad habit. Okay, I don't give feedback. Oh, I really minimize. I make myself small in these situations. Second of all, what is one past or present work or personal relational dynamic that you want to improve? So let's take a minute to think about that. So hopefully you're starting to think about what is that for you, right? And maybe it isn't an answer to both of them. It might just be one thing that's kind of adding stress to your life. You're just feeling a little bit of agitation in that area. So with that, let's start with the first element that I was referring to, which is the power of thoughts. Because the truth is, if we think differently, we can feel and act and behave and live and show up differently. So the first element that I want to bring up for that, and this is also on your worksheet, is what's the story you tell yourself about that behavior or that habit that you're trying to break, right? What's the story behind that? And the second piece is what's the story that you tell yourself about you or that other person? And so when I mean by story, I mean a narrative that we construct within ourselves to make sense of what's going on. So an example could be stay small, because if you stay small, you will be really safe from rejection. That's one story or narrative. Another one could be, let's say if imposter syndrome is at play, you can actually think about, you know what? I'm not enough. I'm too much. I'm too little. I'm too old. I'm not experienced enough. All the different stories we tell ourselves. So with that, let's take a minute to reflect on that for ourselves. I think most people are wrapping up, so that's great. So again, no worries if you don't have an answer. There's no right or wrong answer. This is just to begin to understand what might be happening for you, right? Because again, underneath any behavior is a thought. So let's do a little debrief. And as I do that, I really want to invite you to jot down whatever might be relevant. There's actually space in the back of your worksheet. So I want to really encourage you to notice, what is the role that shame has in your story? So shame is a narrative about our inherent worth. Usually it says something about us not being enough, too much or too little, and definitely not worthy. So thinking about those that are Brené Brown fans, you would know what this is. Really, what's the role of shame in my story? Now, when it comes to that second question about the story with that other person, we definitely have the same kind of similar shame narrative that's at play. And I want to encourage you to think about this. Many of us do what's called fortune telling or mind reading. And what that is simply we will fortune tell that something bad will happen to us, right? Such as they will not be confident in me as a leader if I say no. Or mind reading. We do this a lot with our superiors, such as a manager. I don't think she liked it. I don't think she likes me, right? And it's very interesting because we will mind read somebody else, but we actually expect people to mind read us. Where let's say we have a boundary that needs to be set or one that's already been set and not reinforced, yet we will actually expect that they will mind read us and we will not communicate with clarity to them. More on this later. We're going to do a little more on that piece. But I want to move on to the second piece, which is the power of feelings. I love this one. So let's think about this for us, because underneath any of the narratives that we talk about to ourselves, that thought life, right, is a feeling. We have lots of feelings, right? And the two questions I'm going to have us reflect on is consider that habit or behavior that we want to change. What's our feelings about that? And you actually have what's called a soul word or a feeling word list at the back of your worksheet. And I'm going to encourage you to circle anything that's relevant, that really jumps out at you as that's exactly how I feel. The more specific, the better. And also the second question is about that relation with the other person, the feelings that you have. So thinking about that and being really clear, the more specific, the better. So a hint, for some people, very, very hard to actually pinpoint their feelings, because when they grew up, they actually had a range of emotions that were okay when they were growing up, right? Maybe happy was okay, but definitely nothing in the sad range, right? And so I want to encourage you to really explore all that's there. Usually when people say, oh, I'm just stressed, but under stress is so much. Are you manipulated? Do you feel boxed in? Do you feel overwhelmed, right? The key is to understand the specifics and tuning in to your body. Many times our body will tell us something's wrong. If we deny it up here, the body will tell us, you're actually very unhappy and this needs to be addressed. So with that, I'm going to give you a moment to address these two questions. Again, just getting the juices flowing. In tears, there's actually an antiseptic protein that kills and destroys bacteria that's actually very dangerous to your immune system. So in some cases, if you don't cry, you can actually make yourself sick. And I love talking about the brain. When we think about the brain, there's actually research that shows that when you are very flooded, what's called flooded, which is basically you are in fight or flight mode, you are seeing red, you're triggered, that it actually is recruiting that amygdala, which is basically the center of the brain here. And so that prefrontal cortex, which is basically that rational, exec functioning space where you're actually thinking logically, because many of us do not do the best behaviors when we are like that in that fight or flight mode, it gets recruited. That prefrontal cortex gets recruited when we name our emotions. So literally just by naming emotions, we can feel better. And so I like to give the story of my 3-year-old. And I have a story, actually, I have a song that I sing to her, and the lyrics go like this. It's okay to have big feelings. Use your words, not your actions. Many of us grew up that emotions were bad. That was bad. That part of it was bad. But I want to distinguish, there's a difference. It is okay to feel, it's actually good to feel all those emotions. What is the bad part is what we do with it, right? We get to decide. So I love what Dr. Susan David says, is that we need to view emotions as data, not necessarily directives. So if we do that, we can actually see that it is very useful information, right? I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that. That's very useful information. Back to the iceberg analogy, when you know your feelings, you know your needs, okay? And when you know your feelings, you know what's really going on inside. I do a lot of different kind of counseling and coaching. One of the things I do is actually counseling for couples. So I want to say in that space, there's a lot there. I'll give you an analogy to make this real. I like this analogy because it's a analogy or a story about how I discolored my husband's white shirt. We were newly married, and that was one of the first things I did as a newly minted wife. And so my husband just innocently was like, here, this shirt is no longer white. And I recall absolutely being triggered by that. And I was defensive. And I said, you should do your own laundry. You should be grateful that I did your laundry, right? And so on and on and on. But when I actually think about what was really going on in the base of that iceberg for myself, I felt shame. And what that story told me was, you're not a good wife, and you're not a good housekeeper, whatever little model that I had in my mind, right? What a good woman was. And I told myself, wow, you can't even get that right. And so in that, I realized, wow, if I can get down to the base of that, it saves a lot of turmoil and tension in relationships if I can really identify what is going on for me, because oftentimes it's me, not them. I love this quote, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is the power to choose a response. Many of us talk about mindfulness and meditation, and we go to yoga, and we're like, I gotta get centered. But I'm telling you right now, that's just a piece of the equation. What this means, and this is captured in this quote, is in the stimulus, when I feel triggered, and when I respond, there is a space. So if I take the time to be mindful about what is going on for me, what's the story I tell myself, what's the feelings that are coming up, then I can actually calm down, recruit the prefrontal cortex, and actually choose a better response. Easier said than done, of course, but it takes practice, because emotional intelligence is a flexible skill set that can really be grown. So let's talk about the second piece right here. And I want to encourage you to really reflect on this, particularly when it comes to somebody else, a scenario where they've offended you, yet it actually reminds you of something that has happened to you before in the past. So for example, I coached somebody with a narcissist mom. She had a narcissist mom growing up, and she had a narcissist manager who was a female. And imagine the amount of triggering and projection that she was experiencing. So all of that was so loaded for her, right? So that's a very clear example of many times you have to really just think about that for yourself. What does this remind me of? Why does this feel similar? When was the first time I felt this way before? And really half the battle is the self-awareness. And then let's move into the third piece, which is the power of validation. I kind of use this as an umbrella for capturing a framework or some tips around how do you relate better with the other person, right? With relationships, right? Many times this is one of the biggest pain points that people have. And so instead of giving you tips and tricks and frameworks for communication, I want to leave you with some key elements. The first question for consideration is what I was referring to earlier about mind reading. And that's, how can I be more clear about my unmet needs? So that means setting a boundary, that means reinforcing a boundary, that means giving feedback to somebody instead of just waiting for them to mind read. And then also, how do I ask for clarity when needed? So there's times where I'll be like, I don't know if she liked it, she didn't really comment on this. I am going to ask for clarity about what they may be experiencing with something I've created or something I need feedback on. Maybe it's a work element or how I'm showing up. I'm going to ask. That is a huge emotional intelligence, very simple, but a huge emotional intelligence muscle that we can all exercise. So with that, let's take a moment to reflect on that for ourselves. And secondly, well, actually, before I move on, a part of that piece with the clarity is keep in mind this phrase, making the implicit explicit. I think that's a nice way to get people to stop mind reading and to actually start clarifying and specifically communicating what they really mean about things. So moving into the second question here, which is around validation. So before I jump into that, let me preview a little bit about my nuggets that go with that, which is a lot of us know that whole phrase that says impact is 100% different than intention, right? We all know that. But how that plays out is validation. So the way I define validation is really getting into the space of, let me validate their lived experience of the other person. It is empathy in that I'm putting myself in that other person's shoes, right? And so I'm really thinking about how do I just really empathize with what they're going through. For example, what this could look like is, I can see that you're hurt. And for that, I take 100% ownership. Now that takes humility, that takes maturity, emotional maturity, but it is extremely effective. It actually will transform the conversation. Now this is very hard for people who are self-proclaimed fixers, because we have a lot of anxiety that comes up for us when we see that the other person's hurt, particularly if we're the ones that hurt them. Think about our kids, think about, in our personal lives, but many times we don't validate because we actually feel that that's conceding or that's approving what that other person's doing. But I can assure you, it actually does something very effective. It actually creates emotional safety for the other person where they feel, you've validated me, now I can listen. So with that, let's take a moment to think about what's the power of validation in your life. You can see that underneath that section, the power of validation, as a second question. I know we went through this swiftly, but there is so much here to sink your teeth into. And I just want you to know that I am here to whet your appetite for more. There is more. This is a journey. So my intention was to really open up that self-awareness and revelation where needed. So let's think about that one thing. What's that one thing that we can take away from this time? I said a lot here. So what's that one thing for you? And my homework to you is to actually share that one thing with one person by the end of today. So thinking about maybe a partner at home or somebody you've met here or a colleague, share what is that one thing that you want to do differently as a result of our time together. And lastly, we cannot move from inspiration to action without the emotional intelligence muscle to address the psychological barriers within ourselves or in our relationships that holds us back. How will the world look different if we move to action because we have the emotional intelligence to address that? And so I want to just encourage all of you on this journey. I am here for you. I actually have a exclusive guide that I have created for you. It's 5 pages long. It's very in-depth. It has lots of reading and resources. Please download it today so you can learn more. And I would like to welcome you to a conversation with me about this. I've set up a bunch of consults. I would love to spend some time with you to understand what your goals are and how I can support you. Thank you very much.